I'm really glad that we have James Rebanks here tonight as our keynote speaker. James is a shepherd based in the Lake District of England, which is possibly the most beautiful and also the toughest sheep rearing region in the world.
It's not possibly.
Not possibly, he says. The system of farming found in the Lake District is the same system that has been in place there for thousands of years. So James grew up in the shepherding life and as a teenager became an avid reader. And much to the surprise of some people, I think, possibly even himself, his curiosity led him to attend Oxford, where he graduated with a degree in modern history and a master's in modern American history. James returned to the farm, and in 2012, he started to post pictures of his daily life on Twitter. These pictures got a ton of attention, especially from people who had previously been ignorant of what farming life is like. A literary agent called James and told him he should write a book, to which he responded, "I already have." He had been writing since his 20s. So in 2015, his book, The Shepherd's Life, was published and became a New York Times bestseller the same year. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. If you like British accents, there's also a very good audiobook version of it. And he also published a second book that illustrated Herdwick's shepherd. It turns out he's also a pretty good photographer. So today, James has 102,000 people following his Twitter posts and connecting with real farming. So he's a pretty honest guy. So this means right now there are 102,000 people who are really nervous that James' famous sheepdog, Floss, is going to have puppies while he's here in Iowa. And they will never forgive us, which makes me even more nervous. So James writes and thinks about farming's place and interaction with the rest of the world. He's from far away, but he has great experience and asks really good questions that we should all consider as we work to revive our own farming landscape. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say, so it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you James Rebanks.
When I was about 13, I used to follow my grandfather around the farm. Okay, there's an old farmer called Huey Rebanks, and he only had one tooth, and if you saw him eating lamb chops, it was the funniest thing ever. It was like a jackal eating a lamb chop. He could get all the meat off. But my grandfather left me with all sorts of pearls of wisdom. He was a very, very humble man, but he tried to be a very good farmer. And when I saw Earl receive the award then, I was reminded a little bit of my grandfather because he had the same kind of attitude. He'd rather have been anywhere but at the front of the room getting the rewards that he was due. So congratulations to Earl. But one of the things my grandfather told me was never tell anybody else how to farm. Okay? He said, you don't know the land better than they do. You don't know their troubles better than they do. They may know more than you about a whole bunch of things. Never tell them. So when I read the program for this conference, and it said I was going to give you a vision of how you could restore agriculture in Iowa, I was in a panic. Because no way am I going to come and tell you how to farm your land in Iowa. You're the experts. But maybe I can tell you a little bit about my life and some of the things we've done and some of the challenges we have, and maybe that will be useful for you. So in the background, you can see the landscape that we have. So those are the Herdwick sheep that we keep in our landscape. Anybody here heard of Beatrix Potter? Hands up. Okay. Beatrix Potter is the most famous writer about these sheep. I'm just doddering her along in her tailwind, really. But she used to breed those sheep in the Lake District as well. And she actually left all of her money when she died to the national. She bought a lot of hill farms to preserve them where I live. And she left them to an organization we have called the National Trust, which looks after them. And those are what my people look like. If I had a color picture of me and my friends stood in the sheep pens or our fathers, it would look pretty much like that today, although I think the sheep are a little bit better. If you're wondering where we're at, where I'm from, we're from the little red bit. So from the hill behind my house, you look to Scotland. You can see Scotland in the distance. Okay? Conventionally in English history and English thinking, this is the far end of nowhere. Okay? But they've got that absolutely the wrong way around. It's the best bit of England by a country mile. It's the most beautiful bit of England, and in some ways it's the least English bit of England. It's probably the most Viking bit of England. Okay? So we have a dialect which is almost pure Norse. So we call them a mountain a fell, We call a stream a beck. And if I go to Norway, they call them basically exactly the same things. Any of you that speak Norwegian will recognize some of those words. And it's a really tough, plain, hard, marginal, choose your own word, landscape to farming. I spent the afternoon going around today with Renee and Kevin and Joe in the car, amazed at how flat Iowa is, or this bit of Iowa, and amazed at how much soil you have. I'm tempted to say still have, because I know there are issues, but I think you have more soil in one of your big Iowa fields than we have in the whole of our 13 valleys of the Lake District. So it's a tough place, and it requires a particular kind of farming. So those are our sheep in the snow. And the first thing to say about our way of farming is that it isn't the coldest place in Europe, it isn't the coldest place in the world, it isn't the coldest place where people farm. You farm in much colder conditions in winter than we do. So -17 is like the lowest temperature we've had in the last few years. The toughness of our landscape is the combination of cold and wet and windy for very long periods of time. And any of you that farm livestock will know that cold and wet and windy is often worse than dry and cold. In fact, it's probably the hardest place where sheep live outside all year round in the world. If you go any further north than us, sheep tend to live in colder, drier places than they live inside in the winter. So my sheep have to go through some pretty extreme stuff. But I'm jumping ahead of myself here. When I was 14 years old, and I was at school, I hated school. I thought school was nothing to do with me. Put your hand up if you know any farm boys or girls who don't want anything to do with school. They want to be in the field or on the tractor or feeding the hogs. You know people like that? Yeah, you're all putting your hand up a little bit. That was me. I was that kid. And I thought school had nothing to do with me. Why did they want me to teach me Esperanto or Latin, or why were they talking about Shakespeare? I wanted to talk about sheep. I wanted to talk about cattle. And I didn't think I thought school was all about taking me somewhere else, making me into somebody else, and I didn't want to be that someone else. I wanted to be my father and my grandfather. And there's an episode that I describe in my book which sums this up. I, along with every other kid in my school, had to go and see the careers advisor. You have careers advisors? Yeah. This was in the late 1980s. He'd just got a new computer, one of those sort of large clunky computers from the late 1980s, and he'd just got a piece of software which would take your preferences and tell you what job you should do. Yeah. So his first question was, do you want to work inside or outside? And I said, outside. And one of his other questions was, do you want to work with animals? I said, yes. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes, and then triumphantly, he pressed the return button on his piece of software. It thought for a little while, it shook a little bit, made a noise, and then it printed a piece of paper out, and on the paper was 2 words, only 2 words. It said I should be a zookeeper. And we lived in probably one of the finest stock rearing areas in England, where almost everybody was from a farming family. And I remember thinking, how weird is this world that it has no interest in what I want, no interest in where I'm from, no interest in my culture. With hindsight, I should have been a grown-up 14 and 15-year-old. I should have said, do you know what? I'm going to ignore some of their prejudices, and I'm going to learn as much as I can, and I'm going to learn all the things I need to do to be a good farmer. I wasn't a grown-up 14 and 15-year-old, so I didn't do that. I did the other thing where you misbehave, and you drag your feet to school, and you chat back to the teacher, and you refuse to do what you're told, and you don't do your homework, and you leave on the first possible day that they let you out. And that's what I did. The irony being that I'd only been left school about 6 months when I realized that being on a farm in the middle of nowhere was quite boring. At night. I don't mean through the day. I love farming. But maybe one night a week you could get in the car with your friends and you could go and try and impress girls by doing donuts in a car park. Yeah. But you couldn't do that 7 days a week. There were no girls and there wasn't enough petrol in the world. So what do you do? Well, what I did, I started picking books up out of my mother's bookcase that she'd inherited from her grandfather, and I fell in love with books. And I fell in love with one book in particular called A Shepherd's Life by a writer called W.H. Hudson. And what W.H. Hudson did was he rode out into the English countryside in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and he met this shepherd called Caleb Bowcombe in Wiltshire. And he sat and listened to this guy talk about his life story, and he put it down in a book. He actually edited quite a lot. Apparently, Caleb could talk for hours about how you put sheep hurdles up in the most effective way. So that didn't make it into the book, but the rest of his life did. And this was a light bulb moment for me. After flunking 5 or 6 years of secondary school or high school, I think you call it, I suddenly realized that books were useful and exciting and could be about people like us. And I'd somehow managed to not have that moment all the way through. So I started reading, and it set off a whole sort of double life that I've had ever since. I'll get back to the farm a little bit. So I'm slightly envious of you guys. I don't know whether to be envious or pity you. It's difficult, isn't it? Because you've got a very modern, very, very efficient landscape. I know you're dealing with the problems of that and whether it's gone too far and whether it needs to be more mixed, etc., etc. But you have quite a lot of freedom, relatively, in terms of what you can do on your land. There's all sorts of opportunities open to you. We don't have that. We don't have it for 2 reasons. One, because there's almost nothing else you can do on our land except for what we do. And 2, we don't want to do anything else because we're from a 10,000-year-old farming culture. So the whole landscape, the field structure, the roads, the houses, the buildings, everything is as a result of this 10,000 years of history. And if they ever do awards for the most efficient business-like farming landscape on earth, they won't come anywhere near me and my neighbours. But if they are interested in historic and relatively sustainable old-fashioned farming landscapes, then ours is much more interesting. So we live in very different landscapes with very different pros and cons. And one of the obsessions that everybody in my landscape has is to breed the best of these sheep. Yeah. Now, if we were just businessmen, it should be, can we make the most money out of these sheep? But if I'm being honest, that's not really the obsession. The obsession is to be the top shepherd breeding the best sheep, because that was always the goal that they had in that landscape. This is the other breed of sheep that we keep. So there's a mountain range about 20 miles from where we live where there is another breed of sheep called the Swaledale. One of the amazing things about Britain as a historic farming landscape is that if you travel about 20 or 30 miles, you hit another area where there was another historic breed of cattle or sheep or pigs or poultry. And there's an amazing agricultural diversity there. Which is a huge resource which has been used by people all around the world. So if you go to Australia or wherever else, you find the descendants of those strange breeds that people in the 17th, 18th, 19th century in Britain developed. But they all have very particular strengths. And really their strength is through selective evolution, selective breeding over very long periods of time to survive in our landscape. So the Herdwick sheep that I was showing you, those sheep can survive 6 months of cold, wet rain on a mountain in a way that no other sheep I've ever experienced in my life can. They're really smart on a mountain in the way that most sheep aren't. Most people are used to thinking sheep are stupid. These sheep are really mountain savvy. They know when the weather's coming. They'll go to the right side of the mountain. They know where the best place to be is at different times. They even know, because we have something called hefting. By the way, could I have a glass of water? They even have a bizarre trait, which is more or less a cultural trait, which is that they stay in their own place on the mountain, even though it isn't enclosed and fenced around them. Why do they do that? Because they've been going there in an unbroken genetic chain, with daughter following mother, for, we think, 1,000 years, and possibly 4,500, 5,000 years since the first sheep, which is absolutely remarkable, which means that in the spring when I take my sheep back to the mountain, to the mountain pastures, I'm quite possibly, it's hard to prove definitively, I'm quite possibly doing something that somebody like me did every spring. Thank you, I'm managing to talk myself dry. Which is completely bonkers, isn't it? And actually it gets the hairs up on the back of my neck sometimes. I think, this is amazing. This is really, really rare that around the world you have a farming system that's somehow survived that long. And yes, it has constraints, and yes, it's difficult for me to be really modern and really efficient, but I happen to love it. I happen to think if something can last 5,000 years, that must be relatively sustainable. And that must have, yeah? Yeah. which shouldn't be confused, as I'll come on to, with it being perfect. So we have ecological footprints like you do. There's things we can do better. But I look at that and I think, if the modern age is telling me that doesn't work, I'm not sure whether I believe the modern age. That something can last 5,000 years, that sounds to me like it should be right. So bear with me. Sorry. What I was trying to tell you was, these sheep have like a double fleece. They have like a waistcoat underneath, which is very fine haired, and then they have an outer layer of grey, hard wool on the outside that the rain runs off. They're hardly ever wet at the bottom of their fleece. They are perfectly adapted to do something really clever, which is to survive with the minimum of food on a mountain through winter. And then, round about the 1st of April, when the grass suddenly comes in the mountain, to drop a lamb, preferably one lamb, not 2 or 3, because on a mountain you want one lamb and to go and look after it, and to then milk that lamb to be as big and as good as possible by October when the grass disappears. And the system was simple. Your sheep came down to the valley bottom to lamb, and then they went back up to the mountain on the 1st of April, 2nd of April, whatever, when the grass arrived with their lamb, and they came off in October, and they produced you your replacements for your flock and a cash crop that you sold, or the surplus male lambs that you ate. And that is basically how people lived in my landscape for those 5,000 or 10,000 years. And again, that's remarkable. We also have a few cattle. So those are blue-grey cattle, or a crossbreed of cattle that work particularly well in hardy country. They're very, very good at outwintering. One of the things I've learned on my farm in the last 10 years in particular is that people knew what they were doing in the past. Okay? Now, the story of my farm, and the story I tell in my book, is that my grandfather wasn't actually the same kind of farmer as me. My grandfather was a 1950 modernizing progressive farmer. Okay? Why keep these old heritage breeds? You can keep a more modern lowland breed, and you can buy really cheap food, grain from the American Midwest or somewhere else coming in. You can keep them alive. There's plenty of oil. Put them in a shed. Heat the shed. Put the lights on. And then about 10, 15 years ago, the costs started to kill our kind of farming. So the global commodity prices keep the costs of what we sell down, and the price of everything's rocketing. What's the solution? Well, it comes back to some of the things I've heard earlier, which is my father and I decided that maybe people knew what they were doing in the past. Let's go back to the breeds that they used to have that require no supplementary feeding or little, no housing, can survive in the climate that we have, and can produce something from almost nothing. So my farming system is all about producing as much as I possibly can, of as high a value as I can, from as little as possible. And we're trying to cut out a friend of mine, and somebody I admire deeply, is Wendell Berry, and I think many of you use the expression here, which we don't use, which is shop-bought things. Actually, Wendell said something hilarious to me. I was traveling through Henry County with Wendell Berry, which is name-dropping, but forgive me. And there were some walkers on the side of the highway, and they had the alpine sticks. And Wendell turned to me without any smile on his face at all, and he said, "Alpine walking. That's just normal walking, but with shop-bought sticks." Which I thought summed up many things about the modern world. If you don't buy something, it's crazy. So the big thing that I've learned in my farming, I've learned two big things in my farming life, which is that you're sort of never right and you're never finished learning, are you? Anybody here going to put their hand up and say that they've learned everything they need to know about farming? No, me neither. I'm a long way from knowing everything. Every day is a school day. I'm always learning. So I'm learning about soil, a whole bunch of stuff I wish I'd known 20 years ago about soil. I'm suddenly learning. I'm learning about ecosystems and all the rest of it. I also think I'm learning about economics. So a few years ago, I was asked by a friend to do a business plan for my farm. Do you know what the first line was? I decided if I was going to do a business plan, it was going to be an honest business plan. Do you know what the first line was? I want to keep hold of the farm. Yeah, that's not strictly speaking a business plan objective, but it's my number one thing. We've had our farm or neighboring farms for 600 years, as far back as the paperwork goes. So 600 years ago, in 1420, my family were only about 4 miles over the hill, which means we're the exact opposite of all you adventurous people who set out, got in boats, and came to America and did all sorts of exciting things. We're the people that never went anywhere. And I reckon if it's been okay for 600 years, I'm just going to stick with it. So I'm sticking, and I want to try and respect the stuff I care about, but I want to give it a future. I've got 4 kids. By the way, don't have 4 kids. Yeah, I'm destroyed. But that's a side note. So the point is, a farm is somewhere where you live, isn't it? It isn't just a business. It's somewhere where you live. It's often somewhere where you have roots. It's somewhere where your parents and your grandparents worked. It's somewhere that reflects your values. It's a thing of beauty. It's part of a water system. It's part of an ecosystem. It's part of a place that birds and insects migrate over. It's loads of things other than a business. And I think when we talk about farming, we tend to use the language of economics. There's the language of factories. And I feel like it's a pretty flawed language because it doesn't talk about a lot of the things that matter. So most of what we've been told by economists is that cheap is good. But you all know cheap is not always good. That is not as simple as that. Cheap usually means monoculture. Cheap usually means as industrial as possible. Cheap often means degradation of the things that we care about. So I think we need to be really, really careful about the economic language and to think perhaps less about efficiency and more about balance and sustainability and biodiversity. This is my creed in a nutshell. This is what I believe. So who's this guy behind me? Well, the cute-looking kid with the blonde hair is me at the back. There's my sister at the front, my cousin over on the left, and the guy in the middle is my dad, okay? And when I was writing my book originally, when I'm in my 20s and I'm convinced that I'm Ernest Hemingway, but nobody's asked me to write a book yet, I was going to write a book trashing my dad. Has anybody here, put your hand up if you've ever had difficult family relationships connected to your farm? Okay, so half the people are putting their hands up, the other half are going, I can't, because my sister's beside me. That's okay, I saw the little spasm. The truth is, it's difficult, isn't it? Isn't it really difficult in a family? How do you keep it equal? How do you keep your kids equal? How do you keep the farm going? So, when I got into my 20s, I was ready to farm. I thought I knew everything I needed to know. There was just one problem, my dad's in the way. Except it's worse than that, because my grandfather had only just stopped being in the way of him. Yeah? So my grandfather had only disappeared when I was 17, 18. He'd basically been the patriarch of our family. He happened to treat me like a prince, which is why I worshipped the ground he walked on. After he died, I realized my dad was pretty downtrodden by my grandfather and had suffered it because he wanted to have the farm. And that's a familiar story, I guess, that many of you will know. Farmers aren't always nice. Yeah, we're people, aren't we? We do all the things that people do that are wrong. So, when I was writing this book in my 20s, I was going to get my own back. Big time. If you write the book, you call the tunes, you set the tone. Luckily, nobody asked me to write a book when I was in my 20s. By the time I got to write a book, I was 40 years old. Do you know what I learned in the intervening period? That I didn't know nearly half as much as I thought I did. And my dad was twice the man I'm trying not to cry now. So I wrote a book about that journey that I went on, about learning the good things my grandfather knew and some of the things that he got wrong and the things that my father knew. And my father was deeply skeptical about progress, which is one of the reasons I thought he was an idiot at times in my 20s. He wasn't really interested in money. He thought if you did things on your farm which made lots of money, but they were bad farming, that was just bad. And I would say, yeah, Dad, but we have to do that because everyone's doing it, and that's how you make money. My dad was completely going broke. So imagine how frustrating that is. I'm thinking, God, he's the captain of the ship. He doesn't care about money. Yeah? So really frustrating. 20 years later, I look at it and think, a lot of the things my dad said were right. A lot of the things he said people shouldn't do around us were right. And when we copied them because I thought that was a good idea, that was the wrong thing to do. So I think it's about more than business. And my father died 3 years ago of cancer, and one of the last things he did was to read my book. If you want to be utterly terrified, write a book about your dying dad and get him to read it 3 weeks before he dies. I was quaking with fear and trepidation that I would upset my dad or present him in a way that he didn't like. And he read the book, and he didn't tell me anything about it. And I said, what do you think of it? And he said, well, the last bit's a bit bloody soppy. Because I'd said at the end of the book that I loved and respected him. That was a little too far for my dad, who was old-fashioned. So I went to see my mum, and I said, what does he think of the book? And she said, he cried all the way through it. Yeah? And then my sister tried, because my sisters get on better with my dad than I did at that time. And my sister said, Dad, what did you think of the book? And my dad said, I'm really surprised by it because I come out of it as a bloody legend. Which I think means that my dad knew full well that I was going to trash him at one point in that book. And that he'd got away with it, that we'd come full circle and we got through that thing. Okay, just one more story about my dad before we're done. When my dad found out he was going to die, we said, Dad, what do you want to do? What's your bucket list of things you want to do? You've got like 6 months left. I think you all know what I'm going to tell you now. What do you think my dad's bucket list consisted of? It consisted of mending the fences and gates on our farm that he thought I would never do properly. Yeah? And taking my children with him to teach them how to disrespect me. And to instill in my children how to hang a gate properly because your father will never do it right. Yeah? The serious point being, imagine living a life, I think some of you probably do, I think Earl probably does, and I'll have a beer with Earl later, but imagine living a life where when you get to the end, it's all right, because you did the things you wanted to do. How good is that? All the money in the world, in some fancy city job, or some fancy farm where you did all the right things, that doesn't buy that, does it? You get to the end and you think, I'm not happy. I didn't say enough for my kids. I didn't do things right. My dad didn't have any of that. So thank God I didn't write the book when I'm in my 20s. I'm going to change the subject. That's my dad. My dad used to work on the farm because we couldn't earn enough money just from the farm. He would go out to shear people's sheep for him. So when he was 62 or 63 years old, he came back one day and he very proudly told me that he clipped 6,000 sheep in the season. I'm like, you lunatic. You absolute lunatic. But he loved work, and he loved the old-fashioned community of work that exists in our landscape, and he loved to go with his friends. My dad's friends were all in their 20s doing this work, and he's like trying to beat them, but that was just the kind of guy that he was. But the point was a simple one. When I set out to write the book, and the grown-up version of the book, I wanted to write a book about people like him, people like Earl, and people like lots of you, and I wanted to, if I could, tell people, particularly people in cities, why rural people aren't stupid, why they're not ignorant, why they're not backwards. I wanted to present the pride and the hard work and the dignity and the smartness. And yes, the cussedness sometimes of the countryside people, country people. And that's what I try my absolute best to do. And one of the things I've loved is how much respect I've encountered through that, not for me, but for you. So people, 2 years ago I had to go to do an event like this in a theatre in New York, in the middle of Manhattan. And I'm thinking, who the hell in Manhattan is going to come and listen to me talk about this stuff? There was more people there than there were here. And do you know why? Not because I'm special. It's absolutely nothing to do with me, really. I'm just a conduit. It was because people really care about food. They've become very disconnected from it. They're distrustful of what's going on. They don't quite know how to make the decisions they need to make. But they care about what you do. And I think they're going to care more and more as they get wealthier, as they get more free time, etc., etc. So we need to work on those connections, and that's why I try and do the Twitter thing. That's why I try and do everything I can. I'm by no means the only person doing this, but to try and have a conversation with the public about what they want, and to make it an honest conversation. So if people want mixed rotational farming with livestock in the mix, that's potentially less efficient. That's potentially more expensive. You've got to pay more. So we need to start having real conversations about what that means. Tough conversations about it. That's what you look like when your dad has a best-selling book and you're 5 years old. I think his mother said, look impressed. That's my son Isaac. I'm very, very lucky. The truth is, there's always a great woman behind the scenes, isn't there? So I'm very lucky. I have an amazing wife called Helen, who right now is looking after the ship at home, managing the young shepherdess I have that helps me out on the farm with the sheep, looking after 4 kids, keeping the whole thing going, and looking after my sheepdog Floss, which is about to have pups in the next few days. By the way, just to tell you about how disconnected the people in the wider world are from what we do, I put a 6-second clip of Floss having puppies on social media 3 years ago. 1.1 million people watched it. Yeah? As my dad would have said, dog being born. Yeah? 1.1 million people have got nothing better to do than watch some puppies be born. Yeah? And then you have to correct yourself, don't you? And go, whoa, hang on a minute. If you live in Manhattan, you don't see dogs be born. You don't see calves be born. You don't really know how you cultivate crops. We've let this whole thing get so specialized and so disconnected that people don't know the basic stuff anymore. And every year that goes by, they're further away from knowing. Instead of being their father that did it, it's their grandfather that did it, or their great-grandparents. So it goes on. That's a picture of Beatrix Potter, that lady behind the sheep. Okay? Really quick story I'll tell you. You can read it in my book, but I can't resist telling you. Beatrix Potter buys these little farms in the Lake District. She decides that she cares about the sheep that we have there, the native breed that have been there a very long time, the Herdwicks. She decides she'd like to breed really good ones. Okay? So she hires this shepherd. He's called Tom Story. He looks like he knows what he's doing, doesn't he? He's got that sort of look as if, yeah. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So Beatrix Potter goes down to the sheep pens and she goes through all of the sheep and she chooses the ones that she wants to take to the show to compete with the other shepherds. And then she comes back up to the house and she says to this guy, who's much younger than her, much poorer than her, and working for her, yeah? And she's a sort of wealthy lady. She says, I've chosen the show sheep. And Tom Story says, that isn't happening. And she looks at him sort of slightly strangely. He said, I'm the shepherd, and the shepherd chooses which sheep go to the show. And if you don't like that, you can get another shepherd. And I think she didn't know what to do with this, because she's supposed to be the boss. Yeah? She's probably wondering, is he a sexist little pig? And she's probably, you know, there's all sorts of things going on there. But she actually calmed down. She went to the house, said to his wife that he was a bad-tempered sod. And then she went off, she calmed down, and she actually thought about it. And what she understood, which very few people do when they think about those kind of landscapes or skills, is that actually he had all the knowledge. If they wanted to do the thing properly, she needed him. She needed to respect this guy and his knowledge and his culture. And she decided to work with him instead. And they formed this unlikely partnership where they actually ended up breeding great sheep. And that was the highlight of their showing career. That sheep is called Water Lily. And it won the biggest show that you can win in the Lake District. There's a championship show at Eshtal, or Eskdale, to other people in England. And they won that day. And I love that picture because she's the boss with all the money who bought the farm. And he's holding the sheep. And I look at that photograph and I think, neither of them is quite sure who the boss is. Okay. So we breed those sheep. How do I add value to what I produce? Well, I know that I can't produce lamb as cheaply as many other people around the world. So people in Montana can produce lamb more cheaply than me. People in Australia and New Zealand can produce lamb more cheaply than me. I actually can't get anywhere near their level. So how do I deal with that? Well, I need to produce something really special, don't I, that people look for in the shop, that they want to pay more money for, that they understand that there's a story with about its provenance and they're prepared to pay a premium on. And I specialize in breeding stock. So we sell a lot of rams and we sell a lot of breeding ewes. And we've been lucky, we've exported some of them to Belgium this year and to various other countries. And yeah, so we're trying to sell stuff that's worth more money. And the real passion and the tradition in our landscape is to breed the high quality males. So the saying we have is that the tup, the ram, is half the flock. So he brings half the genetic package, but he can obviously mate with up to 100 or more ewes. So he's obviously worth a lot more than one female because he brings half the package to 100 matings rather than a ewe bringing it to once. So there's something else completely weird about the way we farm. The valley bottoms with the fences and the walls are private land, okay? They are either privately owned and privately farmed, or they're rented and privately farmed by an individual farmer. The mountains are common land. Does common land belong to everybody? No one's quite sure. There's not a lot of common land in Iowa, is there? I'm guessing. No. In the south of England, people think common land must belong to everybody in common. Doesn't mean that at all. It always meant in our landscape that the people of that community had certain rights to take something from the common wealth, the common ground. So we have legal rights, ancient legal rights, to take a certain number of sheep to the mountain, and the number is fixed, and they can take from the mountain during set dates what they can take with their mouths, which is a fantastic old sort of legal way that this is written in the documents. And they go to the mountain and they're counted in units of 6, which are called stints. This is really ancient surviving farming stuff. And if the mountain was overgrazed, the system was that the old shepherds got together and they reduced a stint to 5 ewes or to 4 ewes, and everybody had to reduce their mountain-going flock accordingly to let the vegetation recover. Now, that doesn't mean that they were perfect ecologists. We're learning a whole bunch more at the moment about how we can do these things better. But it's a really interesting example about how you can regulate the common ground to deal with the tragedy of the commons, as some of you may know it. There are 10 flocks of sheep on that mountain. It takes 10 shepherds and shepherdesses and about 25 sheepdogs 2 days to bring the sheep from the mountain. Yeah, it's a 2-day job. And we do it anywhere between 5 and 8 times a year. Okay? Some farms that I'm friends with have land on multiple mountains. So some of my shepherding friends might spend 80, 90 days a year going to the mountain, doing these very specific ancient gathering things. Now, it's kind of balmy, isn't it? Right? And the really weird thing is, everybody takes this for granted where I live. They think this is normal farming. And most of you are looking at me going, this is really weird. 10 miles away in the lowland, they don't even know this exists, or they didn't until recently. If you don't have any contact with it, you don't know anything about it. And there's a whole language that goes with it. So we speak, those Norse words that we speak are nearly all associated with this work. So we're looking after the landscape in basically a Viking way. Our sheep came on the boats with the Viking, at least partly, their genetics. Our practices are Viking, and our dialect, because it's associated with the practices, is Viking, which again is completely weird. I'm like, you guys live in the future, and I'm living about 1,000 years ago in some of the things I do, which is completely mad. Bear with me. Those are some of my friends. So the old fat guys, don't tell Mason I said that. The old fat guys and the lazy people, that includes me sometimes, ride on the motorbikes, and the youngsters go on foot and they go in the crags and on the mountainy bits. And we take those sheep down across the mountain. Now, if you can imagine 10 large flocks of sheep, all grazing peacefully in their own place on the mountain, but with no fences around them, and then you gather them with 25 sheepdogs over this vast mountain range, you're actually bringing down, you might be bringing down thousands in some cases of sheep, and then you have to have a whole infrastructure, historic infrastructure around the fells to sort them back into their individual flocks to go back to the farmsteads, to be sheared or to be wormed or to have their lambs or to be mated. So there's a whole culture that exists around this. And another reason I wrote the book was that I was really frustrated because I'd grown up thinking this was normal. And then as I got older and started to talk to other people in the world, I realized that what we did was kind of amazing. Yeah, it was kind of rare and ridiculously historic. And then I wanted to tell people about it. I didn't actually know whether anyone was interested. Yeah? So it's been a real thrill to see that people are actually interested. People do respect things that have lasted that long. People care about these things. That's taking the sheep down from the mountains. So we gather them at the top, walking down across the mountains, taking them down home. There's a rumor going around that I'm famous, but in truth, I don't think anyone knows who the hell I am. Everyone knows my sheepdogs. So the dog on the left is Floss. The dog at the front is the father of our pups, Tan. The dog at the back is a dog I trained and sold called Sky. So one of the things the shepherds do where we live to make money is that they breed sheepdogs, they train them till they're quite good and they sell them. And there's one made £15,000 a couple of years ago. So these make big money. Yeah. And if you ask any of my friends would they give up the quad bike or the dog, they'd give the quad bike up every single time. The quad bike can't do anything that the dog does. And then the dog at this end is called Meg, and she's the daughter of the other two. And my farm is ridiculously low tech. I don't have a tractor, okay? I don't have a tractor, a single tractor. I have 1,000 sheep, or I did have 1,000 sheep, but I just reduced them a little bit for winter. And so my crop in summer is made by one of my friends that has a contracting business that will come and bale me some hay in the valley bottoms, so I make 300 big bales. I do very, very little else mechanically. Most of my business is done on foot or on my quad bike with my dogs. It's literally, in some ways, gone back to that old model of how you look after the land. Now, I have to, unfortunately, accept that I can't earn an amazing amount of money from that. So I have to do all sorts of other things. I try and keep that going because I love it and I respect it and I think it's important. But I have to work out how to make a living, which is why another reason why you might write a book, but that's maybe not the best plan for making money. But that's a picture of my father. That's typical weather. By the way, if you tweet or you do Facebook or whatever from your farm, you will, I promise you, because I do, show far too many pictures of sunny days and people smiling and flowers, and far too few days of the middle of winter when your hands are freezing and you can't use the wrench on a water trough and all the rest of it. So if you do that stuff and you're talking to the public, I think we all have to try harder to share the difficulties and the setbacks. That's one of our hay meadows. Quickly tell you an anecdote about that. By the way, tell me when I've got 5 minutes left, otherwise I'll keep going forever. One of the things I've learned by doing Twitter and talking to these 100,000 people from all around the world is that lots of people have got concerns about the stuff we do. They're concerned about the soil, they're concerned about biodiversity, they're concerned about insects, they're concerned about birds, they're concerned about flooding and water quality. Now, I'll tell you the truth, right through my 20s, I was resistant to listening to that. I was sort of slightly angry young man who could shut it out. I used to think these people were armchair farmers. They always thought they knew more than us. They didn't really have to cope with the difficulties we had. They went to the supermarket and they bought the cheapest stuff, so why should I respect all of their fancy words about what they wanted to happen? They were really shaping the world through their shopping. I've come to the conclusion I was wrong, again. Life's full of learning you're wrong, isn't it? I think people really do want those things. And rather than argue with them, in the last couple of years, I've discovered a really, really neat trick, and I recommend some of you do it as well. When somebody criticizes what you're doing, be they an ecologist or a river expert or whatever it is, invite them to come to your farm. Yeah? Say, rather than having a row, come to my farm or our farms and tell us what you want us to do and listen to our point of view and we'll listen to yours and let's talk about this and see if there's any kind of compromise. It sounds obvious. I have learned so much. So there's a guy on Twitter from where I live who's an expert on plants. And rather than have a row on the internet, we got in touch with each other one night and I said, why don't you come? Why don't we do a plant survey? I've never done a proper plant survey of our meadows. So he came out, really, really smart young guy, did a plant survey of our meadows. I was staggered. It's one of the most exciting things I've ever done. So we thought between us that we might have 40 or 50 species of plants in my hay meadows. Turns out we had between 80 and 90. Yeah? Amazing. Loads of rare stuff that he didn't think was going to be there, I didn't think was going to be there. And I'm so used as being a farmer in the public eye to getting a kicking for doing things wrong, I couldn't quite believe I was doing some things right. Yeah? Not everything you're doing is wrong. So it's great when that happens. I also work with a river trust, a charitable body that's helping me to fence off the riverbanks and to let the habitats restore. We're even starting to do things that once would have freaked me out. Like we're going to, instead of having a canal river through a meadow, we're going to let the river go back to its original course, which is better for flooding and better for fish and other things. And I'm working with them, trying to work out how we keep as much meadow as we can and how we protect the meadow from the flooding. But this stuff's quite good fun. When you get into it, it's actually quite good fun. You might need some support, you might need other charities or government or whoever else to help pay for it, but this stuff's good. We also have school visits to the farm, not as many as we used to have, but up until a couple of years ago when I got a little bit busy with this book life alongside my farming, we have primary schools come to the farm. I absolutely love it. You have no idea how disconnected kids are from nature and farming these days. It is incredible. So the kids that come to our farm are from country schools. The school where I went, for example, when I was a kid. You'd think if you live in a village in the countryside, you would have touched a cow, handled a pig, planted a seed. No. I'm telling you, 80-90% of those kids don't do it anymore. Their parents are too scared to let them outside, or the culture's changed and they play on the computers or they watch movies inside. They don't do simple things anymore. I'll tell you something funny about this. We set up a plan for what all the great things we were going to teach the kids. And we left an hour between 12 and 1 so they could have their dinner, and if the weather was good or bad, they could play in the meadow, right? And then at the end of the day, we give them a form to say what they enjoyed best. None of the fascinating learning activities that we'd offered them scored very highly. Do you know what scored the highest? Spending 45 minutes playing in a field. And the teachers all come to me and they say, don't be disappointed. They don't get to spend 45 minutes playing in a field. It might be the best 45 minutes they've had this month. Isn't that amazing? We have kids that don't play in fields anymore. This is absurd. So part of that is we have people come when it's lambing time. That happens to be my son again. That's the first time he'd ever lambed a sheep, so he helped me a little bit with it, and he got goo on his hands. You can tell, can't you? That's what you look like when you're not sure you want to be a sheep farmer at age 4. By the way, little detail. Can you see Floss at the back? Yeah. Floss, I have a command for Floss, which is get on the bike, right? And she has to go and sit on the bike wherever it's at. If I happen to need a hand out, I'll bring her back to me. She can catch a sheep and bring it to the ground and hold it for me. But when I'm lambing, she has to spend a lot of time being patient. But she can't stand being patient, which is why she's staring like mad at everything I'm doing in that photograph. Just a quick thing about those sheep that we keep. We tried more modern breeds when I was a kid and before that, okay? When we were changing back over to the heritage breeds or the native breeds, we had a snow blizzard came in the middle of lambing time. Now, bear in mind that we lamb our sheep outside, right? It's the middle of April, suddenly it starts to snow, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 inches of snow, and the wind's blowing sideways across the field. I went to the field one day, and all of the newborn lambs that were the modern breed, the improved lowland, more efficient breed, are starving, which is our word for cold, and they're freezing, and if I don't get them in the barn very quickly, they're all going to die. So I spend like 3 hours leading these sheep into the barn. Not one of the native breed sheep that I have to take into the barn. In fact, just to make this hilarious, they were doing a game where they ran along the wall, jumped over stones, and jumped over the troughs. So they were so indifferent to the cold. And that's what those native breeds and heritage breeds can give you. They can give you the hardiness to cope with the specific environment that they're in. And one of the reasons is that they're born with a leathery coat and about an inch worth of wool. So the mother literally peels the afterbirth off the top of them, and they're ready to go. Yeah, it can snow on the top of them. They're kind of okay. Not all of them, but most of them. And another amazing thing these sheep do is if they're buried under a snowdrift, there's lots of stories in the past, they will eat their own wool, they'll eat the moss and the lichen from the stones, they'll even eat the tree roots, anything, but they survive. Whereas we know from some of the blizzards in the 1960s that the more modern breeds were utterly wiped out. So it's about hardiness. Not very nice, but things die on farms. We know that, don't we? Yeah. And there's too much Disney. I'm sick of Disney. Disney, sentimental nonsense, okay? If you grow crops or you grow animals, things die, sometimes at your own hand because they have to, whether they're pests or vermin, sometimes because it's an animal we're going to eat for meat. But even if you grow crops, you have to kill things, right? So I was in a barn today, I saw a coyote hung from a barn door. Now, I don't know, maybe some of you agree with that, maybe you don't, but farming can be quite a tough business. And I think we've shied away from it too much. I think since the 1960s, we've been lured into this idea that if only you don't talk about the stuff that scares people, it'll all be fine. No. People get more sentimental. They get more disconnected if we don't talk about it. So I think we need, in all of the communications we need, I think we need to be really honest and share some of that. That's my eldest daughter, Molly, showing a sheep at one of our shepherd's meets. So when those shepherds brought all those sheep down the mountain in the images a little while ago, they used to meet up in certain places at certain times on the edge of the mountain, and they used to exchange back their sheep. If you didn't collect the sheep, you were fined. So a month ago, I was... Hello, Trouble. Don't worry, we were all little ones. So a month ago, I was fined the pricely sum of 50 pence because I forgot to go to the shepherd's meet and collect a stray sheep. Yeah. Now this was hilarious because it wasn't actually my sheep. One of my neighbours thought it was, so we had to pass the fine on to somebody else. But where these shepherds met and when they did these meetings, it quickly turned into a competition. I don't know when, maybe 300 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, maybe further back. And there was this huge pride in having the best sheep. So the sheep with the best teeth, the sheep with the tightest wool, the sheep with the best conformation, the sheep with the best feet, whatever, you know, the sheep of different ages. Actually, there isn't one about feet, but they do have to be on good feet. And that's a picture of my daughter with a lamb that she bred out of her own ewes that won a prize at one of our shows. And one of the things I love most about my farming life is that not only did I get lucky in the big scheme of things to grow up in a beautiful place and to follow my grandfather around and my father and learn the things I knew and didn't know, but my kids get to do that as well. And I absolutely love seeing that. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? And whenever I think about, could I do something else? I think, no. I want my kids to see where their food comes from. I want them to touch soil. I want them to see things live and see things die and understand what nature and what farming is. So that's it, one of the shepherd's meets. The other thing I love about farming, and I reckon lots of you love about farming probably, is that you're outside in the natural world, aren't you? I happen to love birds. I'm not the world's leading expert on birds, but I love the birds on my farm. And this summer I fell in love with the plants on my farm. So I was from one of those families where you were taught about the productive grasses. Okay? So I've always known about them, but the other 80 things growing in the field I had no interest in whatsoever until I got with the botanist and I started to change my views on these things. And it's the same with birds and other things. So I have a friend who is a conservationist who works with birds. And that's good as well, because he challenges me. He says, look, things have been lost. You might love your way of life, but over the last 500 years, things have been lost. How do we put that stuff back? So these conversations, I think, are really interesting. And if we're gonna go to consumers in shops, or we're going to go to people in elections and say, vote for spending money on farming, vote for spending more in the store on things that are right instead of things that are wrong, then we're going to have to be really, really good at saying about how it's going to benefit wildlife and retain soil and all the rest of it. So I think our future, particularly our public relations future, depends on these things. We have to have a really good story about this. And if we're not doing the right things about soil, or we're not doing the right things about birds, we need to be scratching our heads and thinking, why not, I think. By the way, this whole presentation has been stolen by my son pulling funny faces, hasn't it? That's one of the groups that come to the farm, and something else, I mentioned it before, but around this ridiculous historic system of farming, which still survives and still does okay, nobody's making a lot of money, but they're hanging on, there's a whole culture about sheep marks, okay? So those 10 flocks that come off the mountain have to have a mark in them, a mark you can't delete or cheat on, which tells you they belong to that flock. And the way that people worked out to do that a long time ago was basically through notches to the ears. Okay? Little slit in the left-hand ear, little notch out the front. And you can date the farms in our landscape by how simple their marks are. So the first people to settle some of those valleys, the Viking people that went to the head of the valley, basically took the end of the ear off, just like the last centimetre of the ear off, really simple. The second person couldn't do that simple thing. Theirs had to be slightly more elaborate. And by the time you get to the 30th person, you end up with these sort of strange combinations of little bits notched out and holes and all sorts of stuff going on. But and we have something called the Shepherd's Guide, which captures all of this information. We also, I've learned all sorts of things since I wrote my book. So in Norway and Sweden, they have exactly the same system, but for reindeer marks. Yeah? And my hunch, I can't prove this, I'd love a historian to work on it. My hunch is that as domesticated animals and farming domesticated animals spread across Western Europe, this came with it. So we know that some of this existed in the Middle East sort of 5,000, 10,000 years ago. It probably comes with those people right around Europe, and we have this whole shared culture about it. Again, can you find a book about this? No, nothing. People don't think about the rural or take it seriously intellectually, but I think it's really interesting. We'll save that a moment. We also have the flock books. So the most prestigious thing you can do in the two breeds of sheep that I breed is to breed one that's so good that it's chosen to have a formal photograph taken of it at the sales or the shows, which goes into the flock book. And there's 120 plus years of flock books now with these in. And the hobby of the old shepherds is to study the pedigree breeding going back on winter's nights. They sit and they pore over this stuff, and they know exactly the sort of, this is like the pedigree of the royal families that are going back 1,000 years. This is the same with the sheep. They follow the bloodlines going back. And that's basically on the lane above my house. The whole landscape where we live is shaped around this system. And the farmers like me in my landscape in a really funny position, okay? We're in one of the most crowded places on Earth, sort of islands on Earth, with one of the most affluent populations on Earth, who are deeply, deeply romantic and sentimental about the landscape around them, do not want it, actually, to be highly efficient. They actually want it to be good for birds, and they want this historic stuff to continue, and they want it to be good for water. And I wouldn't have believed this when I was in my 20s, but I'm slowly coming to the conclusion that what we actually want is a very beautiful, very historic, and actually, in truth, less efficient farmed landscape. I don't think the British public actually want us at all to go down the route of taking out our hedges, taking out our walls, making it much more intensive and industrial, certainly not everywhere in the most beautiful parts of the UK. So that puts farmers like me in a really weird position. We're not as free as a lot of farmers in Iowa would be to do whatever they like on the land or build whatever they like. I live in this weird middle ground where it's highly regulated and highly controlled, and most of the things I perhaps could do to make more money, I'm not allowed to do, or nobody wants me to do, which is really weird. But I think that's going to become more and more normal in lots of places around the world. Maybe not in flat, efficient places like Iowa quite so much, but it's going to become more and more common in the old world, certainly, where you have these little fields and you have a sort of history that people love and things that they want to preserve. When my book came out, I'm not going to talk about my book too much, but when my book came out, people started doing this weird selfie thing where they would take pictures of my book in all sorts of amazing places. So I've got pictures from Ayers Rock, I've got pictures of Germans sitting on deck chairs with it, and then I've got pictures of the White House. I do confess that when I saw this, I did wish it had a bomb in it and they'd thrown it, but that's another story. That's a story for another day. I don't mean to offend half the audience. People are entitled to their choices, and choices are legitimate. The main thing I want to leave you with really is, I don't want to come here and you think, oh, this guy thinks he's marvelous. That's not the point of this talk at all. The point is I'm just probably like most of you. Okay, at the moment I've got a shirt on, I'm sitting at the front and I'm talking too much, but I spend 95% of my life on my farm doing what my father and grandfather did on the day-to-day basis. So yesterday morning I was feeding my sheep in 6 inches of snow. Most of the time, 90% of the time, I don't have any staff on my farm. It's genuinely me doing it. So the point is not that I'm special. The point I think I'd like to leave you with is what you do is really important. Yeah? It's a simple thing to say, but I'm going to say it. Being a farmer isn't stupid, it isn't backwards, it's not pointless, it's not ugly, it's not sort of brutish, it's actually really important, and we sometimes forget about that. We're feeding everybody, right? And that doesn't mean we can do whatever we like. I do think we have to listen to all of those external influences. We're learning about things like ecology, and we're learning about some of the damage that we've done. But my little strange experience of the last couple of years has been that people care very, very much about this stuff, much more than I would ever have believed. Particularly the people that are eating our stuff and buying our stuff. And I think we need to tap into that. And if you're trying to change your farms to make them more biodiverse or make the soil better, or maybe go back to some system that worked better in the past, and you're not sure how it's going to make more money, I think the secret is to tap into that, isn't it? To tap into those people in Manhattan or wherever they are that say they want this stuff. And to say to those people, okay, well, I'll give you it. I'll give you the birds, I'll give you the insect, I'll give you the bees, I'll give you the organic, I'll give you these things. But you have to trust me, and you have to partner with me, and you have to give me more money. I mean, let's be honest, it comes down to money, doesn't it? Yeah? Let's cut the crap that we can do everything. We can't. We can't be more efficient and more biodiverse quite often. We have to make difficult choices. And some places may go down the efficiency route, and some places may go down other routes. And I think we're in a sort of slightly different position on that. But yeah, I just want to pass on some of the love I've felt from people around the world to you. And I'd like you to put your hands together for farmers, because they're bloody amazing, right? Farmers are amazing. And I'm just going to tell you one more thing, which is, although my son can pretend to be impressed by my success with the book, my neighbours aren't so convinced. So about 6 months after my book came out, I went somewhere to do a talk one evening, and I got back about 10 o'clock at night. I'd done a day's work on the farm. I'd left things in good order. And there was a message on my answering machine from one of my neighbours. And the message said, I don't know where the hell you are, but your sheep are all over the parish. Maybe if you spent more time at home doing your work instead of talking all over the bloody place, things would be in a better condition. And do you know what? He's right. Farmers should be farming. So I'm planning to go home and get on with my life in a little while. And I've shared a little bit of me with you tonight and a little bit through my book. I'm writing another book at the moment about how difficult it is to be a farmer in the modern age, to make the right choices when people want to pay you the wrong price, and to try and do these things that even our grandfathers didn't have to do. Did our grandfathers have to know about ecology or soil structure or how nitrogen works? I don't think they did. They had their own challenges, don't get me wrong, and they had to work very hard. But being a farmer's constantly and never-endingly complex and difficult, and it's changing all the time. And I'm full of admiration for what you do, coming together to share those challenges and to work together. I wish actually that the farmers in my landscape collaborated quite as much as you do. I think we have to step up and do that as well. So thank you to the little person who's been brilliant over there for the last 20 minutes. Absolutely. It's very good of you to come. Thank you. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate coming here tonight. And I know I've got another session in the morning talking about some of the practicalities of the farm. But I'm just super, super thrilled to be here. And I'll try and talk to as many of you and maybe sign a book or two later on. Thank you for having me. Okay.